In the autumn of 1891, in the high ranch country of eastern Wyoming, a woman lost everything she had built in a single afternoon. Not to fire, not to flood, but to the signature of a man who had never once worked the land he claimed. Miriam Cord had been married to Fletcher Cord's younger brother, August, for 11 years when August died of a fever in March. She had nursed him through 3 weeks of illness, kept the cattle fed through a late snowstorm, and buried him herself when the ground thawed enough to dig. She had not asked for help. There had been no one to ask. August had left no will. He had meant to write one. He had told her so, more than once, in the easy way men tell themselves there is still time. There wasn't. By April, Fletcher Cord arrived from Cheyenne with a lawyer's letter and a pair of men who stood near the door while he explained that the land had reverted to the family by right of inheritance, and that Miriam's claim, as a wife, and not a blood relation, held no standing under territorial law. She had stood in the kitchen, she had papered herself. In the house she had plastered and painted and filled with 11 years of work, and listened to her brother-in-law explain that she had until the end of the month to collect what was hers and go. "What's mine," she said quietly, "is in the walls and the ground and the 12 years I gave this place." Fletcher looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked at his papers. "The land isn't yours, Mrs. Cord," the lawyer said. She left without raising her voice. She packed one trunk, one satchel, and the quilt her mother had sewn before Miriam was born. She did not look back at the house as she walked away from it. She had learned, somewhere in those 11 years, that looking back at what you couldn't change only made the walking harder. She had a little money, enough for a few weeks if she was careful. She had no family within 300 miles. The nearest town was Harwick, a day's ride east, and she made the journey on foot because the horses, like everything else, now belonged to Fletcher Cord. She arrived in Harwick on a Thursday afternoon, carrying her trunk by its handle, her boots worn through at the left heel. The town was the kind of place that registered strangers quickly and forgot them just as fast. She found a room at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Felton, who charged reasonable rates and asked few questions, and she spent the first evening sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, calculating how long her money would last. 6 weeks, if she was careful. Less, if anything went wrong. Nothing went right either. The laundress at the hotel wouldn't take on another woman. The seamstress already had a girl. The schoolteacher position had been filled in August. Miriam moved through the week collecting polite refusals the way you collect stones, each one small, each one heavier than the last. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had cried when August died, alone in the barn so the sound wouldn't carry into the house. She did not cry in Harwick. She noted her situation the way a surveyor notes terrain. Level here, steep there, no clear path forward, but the land itself not impassable. It was on the 9th day, walking back from the dry goods store with a quarter-pound of cornmeal and nothing else she could afford, that her heel finally gave way entirely, and she went down hard on the plank sidewalk, trunk skidding sideways, contents spilling across the boards. She was on her hands and knees gathering her things when a pair of worn boots stopped beside her. She looked up. The man crouching to help was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had spent years in weather and hadn't complained about it. He picked up her mother's quilt without unfolding it and handed it across without comment. "Thank you," Miriam said. He nodded once and stood, and she thought he would walk on. He didn't. "Your heel's gone," he said. She looked at her boot. "I noticed." He said nothing further. He waited while she repacked the trunk, then lifted it without asking and set it upright. He did not offer to carry it. He simply stood there, as if the matter of what happened next was entirely hers to decide. "I'm Miriam Cord," she said, because the silence had become something that needed filling. "Emmett Hale," he said. That was all. She had seen him before, she realized. He came into town every week or 10 days, bought supplies, spoke to no one at length, and left. Mrs. Felton had mentioned him once in passing. A man who ran cattle on a small spread northeast of town, had lost his wife some years back, kept mostly to himself. The kind of man a town knows by sight and not much else. "Is there work out your direction?" Miriam asked. It was not the question she had planned to ask. She had not planned to ask anything. But the boot was ruined, and the money was running low, and she was tired of collecting polite refusals. Emmett looked at her steadily. Not with assessment, not with the particular kind of attention. She had grown accustomed to deflecting from men who thought widows were available. Just attention, calm and level. "What kind of work?" he said. "Any kind," she said. "I can cook men, keep accounts, work cattle if needed. I've run a ranch before." She paused. "I was running one until last month." Something moved across his face, brief and contained. He did not ask what had happened. He looked down at the broken boot, then back up at her face. "I'll ask around," he said. He didn't ask around. 3 days later, he came back to the boarding house and stood in the doorway of the front room and told her there was work if she wanted it. Cooking and keeping the house, fair wages, her own room at the back of the cabin. He said it plainly, the way you state a fact rather than make an offer. He said she could take a day to think on it. She said she didn't need a day. The spread was called Hales Creek, though the creek itself was more of a seasonal run that only lived up to its name in spring. The main cabin was small and clean and largely bare, furnished with the minimum a man needed to sleep and eat, and nothing more. There was a second room, barely large enough for a cot and a chest, that had once been used for something else. Storage maybe, or a child's room. She didn't ask. Emmett showed her where things were kept, explained that he rose before dawn and ate whatever was ready, and said she was welcome to cook what she liked, as long as the basics were covered. Then he went back outside and didn't speak to her again until supper. It was not an unfriendly silence. It was the silence of a man who had learned to live inside his own head without requiring company to fill the space. Miriam had known men like that. August had not been one of them, but she understood the type. She let the silence be what it was. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept the accounts Emmett had let slide for several months, entering figures in a ledger with a hand that was steadier than she felt. She found small repairs that needed doing and did them without announcing it. A hinge that had pulled loose from the doorframe, a window that let cold in at the corner, a leak in the roof above the back room that she patched with tar and cedar shingles she found stacked in the barn. Emmett noticed. He didn't say so directly, but she caught him looking at the repaired door hinge one morning with an expression she couldn't quite read. 2 weeks in, she asked him what had happened to the creek pasture fence on the south side. He told her. "Post rot from the spring wet, half a mile of it down." "I can help set posts," she said. "I've done it before." He looked at her the way she was beginning to recognize. That level, measuring look that wasn't calculating worth so much as calibrating what was true. "All right," he said. She worked alongside him for 3 days on that fence. It was hard work. The ground still half frozen in the shade. The posts heavy and the wire uncooperative. She didn't complain. She matched his pace as best she could, and when she couldn't, she found the next useful thing, and did that instead. By the second day, they had developed something like a rhythm. Not friendship exactly, but a working understanding. The kind that comes from doing a hard thing together, without getting in each other's way. On the third evening, she made venison stew with the last of the dried onions, and he ate 2 bowls without speaking. When he finished, he pushed the bowl aside and said, "You ran cattle yourself." 11 years, she said. "My husband and I built the herd from 12 head. "What happened?" she told him. She kept it short, the way you tell a story you have already told yourself enough times that the sharp edges have worn smooth. Fletcher, the lawyer, the letter, the month she'd had to pack and leave. Emmett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet a moment. "That shouldn't have stood," he said. "No," she said. "It shouldn't have." He nodded once, as if a verdict had been delivered and received, and picked up his cup. It was in November that Fletcher Cord rode out to Hales Creek. Miriam saw him coming from the window, recognized the horse before the man, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had not told anyone where she had gone. She had not hidden herself, exactly, but she had not advertised it either. Fletcher dismounted in the yard. He was a tall man, well-dressed for ranch country, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to having things go his way. He looked around the place the way he had looked around August's ranch, with the eyes of a man pricing things. Emmett stepped out of the barn before Fletcher reached the porch. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for a woman named Miriam Cord," Fletcher said. "I have reason to believe she's working here." Emmett's expression did not change. "What's your business with her?" "Family matter," Fletcher said. "She's not family of yours," Emmett said. Fletcher's jaw tightened slightly. "She was my brother's wife. There are matters concerning the estate that require her attention." "Then you can leave a letter," Emmett said. "I'd prefer to speak with her directly." Emmett stood where he was, unhurried, solid as the post behind him. "She's not available." Fletcher looked past him toward the cabin. Emmett moved slightly. Nothing aggressive, just a shift of weight, enough to hold the line of sight. "You're harboring a woman who may have outstanding obligations to my family's property," Fletcher said, his voice dropping into something that was meant to sound legal. "I'm employing a woman who has outstanding obligations to nobody," Emmett said, "and you're on private land." Fletcher looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he was calculating, the numbers didn't add up in his favor. He remounted without another word and rode back toward the road. Inside, Miriam stood at the window until he was out of sight. Her hands were steady. She was surprised to find that. She had expected them to shake. She turned to find Emmett in the doorway. "He'll come back," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Bring someone with him, most likely. I don't want to cause you trouble." Emmett crossed to the stove and poured himself coffee. He turned and leaned against the counter with the cup in both hands and looked at her. "You didn't cause it," he said. "He did." That was the end of the conversation. But something in Miriam had shifted. Some weight she had been carrying shifted slightly in its position. Not lifted. Not gone. Just redistributed, shared by more than one set of shoulders. Fletcher came back on a Friday, 9 days later, with 2 men and what he claimed was a sheriff's warrant. Miriam met them at the door before Emmett could get there. She had spent the intervening days thinking carefully about what she needed. And on Tuesday she had ridden into Harwick and asked Mrs. Felton, who seemed to know everyone, whether there was a lawyer in town. There was. A man named Ira Holt, who kept an office above the pharmacy and had a reputation, Mrs. Felton said, for being thorough. Miriam had spent 2 hours with Ira Holt and come away with a letter on official stationery and a far clearer understanding of what territorial law actually said about spousal rights, prior labor claims, and the burden of proof required to enforce a private property transfer. What Fletcher believed the law said and what the law actually said were not entirely the same thing. She stood in the doorway with Ira Holt's letter in her hand and read the relevant portions aloud. Fletcher's lawyer, not the same one from April, a younger man with an uncertain expression, listened with the look of someone revising his position in real time. "The land itself may be a settled matter," Miriam said, "but the cattle my labor built, the improvements I made to the property, and the unpaid value of 11 years of work represent a claim that Mr. Holt informs me has standing in territorial court." Fletcher stared at her. "I have no interest in fighting you for the land," she continued. "I have every interest in seeing this settled fairly. Mr. Holt has drafted a proposal. You can take it with you, or you can come back with your own lawyer and discuss it with his." She held out the proposal. After a moment, the younger lawyer took it. Fletcher said nothing. He turned and walked back to his horse. The 2 men followed. The lawyer lingered a moment, glancing down at the papers, then back at Miriam. "He may settle," the lawyer said quietly. "This is reasonable." "I know it is," Miriam said. She closed the door. Inside, Emmett was standing at the table. He had been there the whole time, within reach but not in the way, a presence without pressure. He looked at her now with something she couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. You went to a lawyer, he said. Tuesday, she said. I used the wages from October. I hope that's all right. It's your wages, he said. You can do what you want with them. She put the kettle on. Her hands were entirely steady. The settlement came in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the form of a letter from Fletcher's lawyer, agreeing to the terms Ira Holt had laid out. It was not everything Miriam deserved. It was considerably more than she had expected, a cash sum representing a portion of the cattle's value, and a formal release from any claims Fletcher might make against her going forward. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then set it down and sat with it for a while. When Emmett came in from the evening rounds, she told him. He hung his coat and poured coffee and sat across from her at the table. He read the letter without rushing. That's fair, he said finally. Fairer than I expected, she said. You earned it, he said. More than this, but this is a start. She looked at him across the table. In the months since she had come to Hales Creek, she had learned to read the things Emmett said in the space between his words. The economy of a man who didn't spend language unless it meant something. What happens now? She asked. He wrapped both hands around his cup. That depends on what you want, he said. You have money now. You could go wherever you were thinking of going before. I wasn't thinking of anywhere in particular, she said honestly. I was thinking about surviving. He nodded. He looked at the table a moment, then back at her. There's enough work here for 2 people, he said. There always has been. I've been managing half of it and leaving the rest undone. Miriam was quiet. That's not an offer of charity, he said. I want to be clear about that. You carry your weight. You always have. It would be a working arrangement. Is that all? She asked. It was not a small question. She asked it carefully, watching his face. Emmett was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, the bare branches clicking together in the cold. No, he said. That's not all. But I'm not going to say more than that until you've had time to decide what you want. You've had enough people make decisions for you. I don't intend to be another one. Miriam looked at him for a moment. She thought. About the kitchen, she had papered herself, and the house she had filled with 11 years of work, and the morning she had walked away from it with one trunk and her mother's quilt, and the certain knowledge that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She thought about the fence posts they had set together in half-frozen ground, and the ledger she had put in order, and the way he had stood in the yard and told Fletcher Cord that she had outstanding obligations to nobody. I've already decided, she said. He looked at her. I want to stay, she said. Not because I need a place. I can find a place. I want to stay because this one feels like it could be mine, the way something only feels like yours when you've put your hands into it and it's given something back. The fire popped softly in the stove. Then stay, Emmett said. It's yours if you want it. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Not in gratitude, something steadier than that. Something that had been building slowly in the way of things that last. He turned his hand over and held hers, and that was enough. Winter settled deep over Hales Creek, the kind of cold that made the cabin walls creak and the horses stamp in their stalls. Miriam moved through those months with a sense of order she had not felt since before August died. Not the order of survival, of calculating how long the money would last, but the order of a life with a shape to it, a rhythm she had helped to build. She kept the accounts and expanded them, noting not just what was spent, but what could be earned. She identified 3 areas of the grazing land that had been underused and proposed a rotation. Emmett listened, asked 2 questions, and said they'd try it in spring. She wrote to Ira Holt to confirm the settlement had been properly recorded. He wrote back, confirming it had. She filed the letter in the back of the ledger and did not think about Fletcher Cord again. Some mornings she woke early and lay in the dark listening to the wind and the sound of Emmett moving in the kitchen, the soft clink of the stove lid, the pour of water into the kettle, and she thought about the word home, what it meant, what it cost, what it required. It required, she had decided, something more than shelter. You could shelter anywhere if you were determined enough. What made a place a home was the right to shape it, to say this is where I put my hands and this is what grew, and have that mean something, have it be recognized, have it be real. In February, a letter arrived from a woman named Cornelia, August's cousin, who had heard somehow what had happened with Fletcher. The letter was kind and outraged in equal measure, and ended with an offer of a room if Miriam ever needed it. Miriam wrote back thanking her and said she was settled, that she had work she valued, and a place that was coming to feel like hers, and that she hoped Cornelia would visit in summer, when the ride was easier. She did not explain Emmett. There was no way to explain him quickly, and she had found that the things that mattered most were often the ones that resisted quick explanation. One evening in late February, as the temperature dropped and ice formed along the edges of the creek, Emmett came in from checking the cattle and stood near the stove, warming his hands. He looked at her from across the room with that quiet, leveled attention she had come to trust. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set down the mending and looked at him. "My wife," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "Her name was Catherine. She died in '86. Fever, same as your husband. I was away when it happened." He looked at his hands. "I came back to a house that was still warm from her being in it, and I spent a long time after that just keeping things running. Not living in them, just keeping them going." Miriam waited. "I'm not telling you that to ask for anything," he said. "I just thought you ought to know it. Why the house was the way it was when you came. Why the ledger was a mess. Why I'd let half the work go undone." "I know why," she said. He looked up. "Because you were doing the work that kept you occupied without doing the work that meant anything," she said. "I know because I did the same thing. For months after August died, I just kept the ranch going. I didn't grieve. I worked. And then one day, Fletcher showed up with his lawyer, and I had nothing left to keep me occupied with, and I had to feel all of it at once." Emmett was quiet for a while. Then, "Does it get easier?" "It gets different," she said. "And different starts to feel like better, after a while." He nodded. He was looking at the fire. "It already does," he said quietly. "Feel better." She picked up the mending again. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the night was still and cold and clear, the kind of night that made the stars look close enough to touch. She had not expected this when she walked into Harwick with a broken heel and a nearly empty purse. She had expected to survive. She had made herself a plan around survival, around calculating what she needed and how to get it, and what she would do next. She had not expected a man who stood in a yard and said people aren't property. She had not expected to find, in the middle of losing everything, that she was still someone who could choose, that the choosing was still hers. Spring came with mud first, then green, then the creek running full and loud and living up to its name for the first time since she'd arrived. The cattle came through winter better than expected. The south fence held. The rotation she had proposed would begin in April. One morning she stood at the door of the cabin and watched the light come up across the pasture, the grass just beginning to show, and she thought about the word hers. The way it felt now, settled and certain. The way it had felt before only when she wasn't thinking about it, she thought. "This is mine because I am allowed to say so, and because I have put my hands into it, and because the man inside making coffee understands the difference between giving a person shelter and giving a person the right to stand on the ground they've earned." The door opened behind her and Emmett stepped out with 2 cups, and she took hers without turning, still watching the light move across the grass. "Creek's running," she said. "Heard it this morning," he said. They stood together in the doorway as the sun came up, the steam rising from their cups into the cold spring air, the land opening itself slowly around them, like a question they had already decided to answer. And that, she thought, was what home finally felt like. Not given, Not found, chosen and held and grown into, the way everything worth keeping has to be.